On 25th of July 2025, the Union Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change has notified Environment Protection Management of Contaminated Sites Rules 2025 under the Environmental Protection Act of 1986. This is the first time where India has taken a formal step in response towards chemically contaminated sites. And also, this is the first time where India has codified a procedure to identify, assess, and remediate sites which have been chemically contaminated over the last many years. Also, to identify, assess, and remediate those sites which have been historically being dumped by hazardous chemicals and has polluted the soil, has polluted the groundwater, surface water, posing long-term health hazards to public health and ecosystems in and around itself. Which is why, from environment and ecology perspective and the response of government in relation to protection of the environment of our country, this particular rule becomes very, very important. Hello, my name is Pritpal Singh and you are watching Perspective. Now, without beating around the bush, first of all, let us understand what do you mean by these chemically contaminated sites? Or actually, what do you mean by contaminated sites? Now, according to CPCB, Central Pollution Control Board, they say that contaminated sites are any locations where hazardous or other wastes have been historically dumped. So, hazardous or any other waste historically dumped in a place can be called as contaminated site, which is often prior to the enforcement of proper regulatory mechanisms in that particular place. Now, which means these sites might include dumps, landfills, waste storage, treatment sites, spill sites, chemical waste handling and storage sites as well. Now, in all over India, till now, there have been 103 such contaminated sites, which we can call, according to CPCB, chemically contaminated sites. But the sad part is that the remedial operation has only been undertaken in just 7 out of these 103 chemical contaminated sites. And some of these sites, they were contaminated when there were no rules, no regulations on management of hazardous waste as well in the country. Which is why, to address this particular issue of contaminated lands, contaminated sites in the country, the government of India, especially the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change, has come up with Environmental Protection Management of Contaminated Sites Rules 2025. Now, the aim of these rules are very, very simple. It aims to provide legal and procedural framework to identify, assess and remediate chemically contaminated sites all across India, which is 103 in total. Now, talking about the key features of these environmental protection rules. See, first of all, it provides a legally binding and time-bound framework for the entire remediation process, which is why there are around 5 steps which have been laid on in these rules in order to remediate the problem of contaminated sites. Now, the first step is in relation to identification and reporting. Now, in this step, the district administration must prepare a half-yearly reports listing suspected contaminated sites in that particular district or in the vicinity of that district. So, half-yearly report needs to be prepared where it would be mentioned that what are the suspected contaminated sites and who will be doing this? District local administration would be doing this. Also, alongside this, these reports would be sent to the State Pollution Control Board (SPCB) or a designated reference organization. And this completes your step 1. Now, in the step 2, there will be preliminary assessment which will be done. So, which means the reference organization or the body, they must complete preliminary assessment within 90 days of receiving the particular file or receiving the particular reports to ascertain the likelihood of contamination in that particular land, that is that land contaminated or not. So, in the first step, there is suspected contaminated sites which are listed down in the form of reports. In the second step, they are assessed by the body within 90 days of receiving the report. Now, if the environmental body or the reference organization, they find that there are proofs of this site getting contaminated or being contaminated, then a detailed site survey would be conducted. Which means that if a contamination is likely, a detailed survey must be completed again within next 30 days of the body or the organization stating that there could be contamination. So, within 90 days of the organization stating that there could be contamination, a detailed site survey needs to be conducted. The question is, what would be assessed in the survey? See, there is one particular rule published in 2016. It is known as Hazardous and Other Waste Management and Transboundary Movement Rules of 2016. Now, under that, there is a list of 189 hazardous chemicals. So, there would be checking of any of the 189 hazardous chemicals which are listed under this Hazardous and Other Waste Management Rules of 2016. If the site is to be found contaminated of any of the 189 chemicals which are listed here, and then it will be publicly known notified and the access to the particular site would be completely restricted. That is your step third. So the first step is suspected contaminated sites, second step is assessment, and third step is the detailed survey. Now, after that, there is a fourth step, which is remediation planning. That what to do now. Now we know that the site has been contaminated, and by what chemical, that also we know. Now the question is, how do we remediate? What would happen in step 4 is that a reference organization, a specialized organization comprising of scientific experts would then propose a remediation plan for that particular area, for that particular land specifically. And also the state board must identify the person or organization or persons responsible for the contamination in that particular land, and that too within 90 days it should be done. That is a step 4. So in step 4, a remediation plan is proposed, and also the state board needs to identify the person who, because of which the site has been contaminated, and that too to be done within first 90 days of the survey being conducted. And from the survey it is highlighted that the site is contaminated. After that, in 90 days, the state board must find out the person who contaminated that particular land. And then comes the final step, that is cost, recovery and liability. See, those responsible for the contamination would be bearing the cost of remediation fully. Now, but the question arises that what if the polluter is unavailable? Or we can't state that who's the polluter. Then in that case, in these special circumstances, the state government and the central government, they will split the cost under a prescribed arrangement amongst the two. So firstly, the person who is responsible for the contamination, they would be likely to pay for the costs. If that person is not able to, we are not able to find that particular person, then in that case, central and state government, in whatever proportion they agree to, they would be bearing the cost of remediation. Also, there's a provision of criminal liability over here, that if it is proven to be a loss of life or to be a serious damage which has been caused due to this particular contamination, in that particular case, the case would be taken up under the Bharatiya Nyaya Sanhita 2023. So which means if criminal liability would be there, then this case might turn into a criminal case under the Bharatiya Nyaya Sanhita of 2023. Now these are all the rules and steps which have been laid out in this environment protection rules. Although one more important thing in relation to these rules is about the scope and exemptions. Now first of all, there are certain categories of hazardous chemicals which are excluded in this particular rules, which means that while these rules are comprehensive, they exclude certain categories which are already covered up in certain other acts or certain other legislations. And first of the example is radioactive waste, which is already covered under Atomic Energy Act. So that is excluded under these particular rules. Also, mining related contaminations, which are also governed separately through different legislations, are also excluded from these rules. So radioactive waste, mining related contamination, or marine oil pollution, that is also not related to this particular act, and municipal solid waste dump sites are also excluded from this particular rules. So these 4 categories of hazardous waste are excluded from these rules because they are being dealt with separate legislations and separate rules altogether. Which is why, to avoid regulatory overlap and to ensure that the specialized agencies, they carry out their operations in a specialized way and there is no overlap or there is no mixing of jurisdiction, and there should be no complexity in governance of the waste streams or waste lands, which is why these particular chemicals have been excluded. Now, as you can see that the rules deals with contaminated lands, and contaminated lands which are chemically contaminated are very hazardous for human health and for the health of ecosystem as well, which means that the rules which have been designed to remediate these contaminated lands, they have a lot of significance. They hold a lot of significance, which is why this notification in actuality, it marks a paradigm shift from fragmented enforcement to structured environmental remediation in our country. See, previously there was long regulatory inaction which used to be there, and long delays in cleanups of these chemically hazardous wastelands. But after coming up of these rules, this is now a legally codified framework for addressing the problem of contaminated sites, which is a very wonderful thing. And also in these particular rules, one very good thing is that the responsibilities of the district administration, district officials and pollution boards have been completely laid. So which means they have been made responsible. Also, timelines for assessment and responses also been laid, which means that in a particular timeline, this particular process needs to be completed. So which means time-bound completion of the projects, time-bound completion of remediation projects also is definitely there, which means efficiency is also taken care of in these particular rules. And other than that, polluter pays mechanism for cost recovery in itself is a wonderful concept, which is already a part of the Environmental Protection Act. So all these rules in general makes it very good for the environment, for the ecology, and for the betterment of the ecosystem of our country. However, still, these rules definitely have a strong foundation, but there are certain challenges which needs to be taken care of in order to ensure that the rules run smoothly. See, first thing which needs to be focused upon, which might become a bit of a hinge or a detriment, is the scientific ability or the scientific capacity for hazardous chemical assessment. So, because scientific assessment in our country for hazardous chemicals especially is not top notch or is not state of the art, which is why that can be a detrimental factor. Other than that, since there are certain institutions which are involved, for example, district bodies are involved, state board is involved, then CPCB is involved. So sometimes there might be lacunas in relation to coordination. There might be some coordination hiccups, there might be some coordination delays also, which is why institutional problems might arise because of this. That is another point which needs to be taken care of by the authorities. Other than that, the biggest issue is in relation to funding. See, the polluter pays mechanism is wonderful, that whoever pollutes pays. So whoever is responsible for contaminating the site would have to pay the cost for remediation. But if you remember in these rules, if it is difficult to ascertain that who is the polluter, then in that case the central government and state government would share the burden. And that too not 50-50, but in prescribed from which they might ascertain. Now this is where the problem might arise, because most of the times the state government would want lesser portion and they would want central government to pay more for it. But central government would want the opposite. So which is why there might be a tussle in relation to the center or state relations also while involving the cost of these remediation measures. So which means that nobody is liable, no party is liable. Then in relation to funding support, there can be certain issues, challenges or lacunas which could be seen. Now other than that, one more thing which needs to be taken care of is public awareness and public participation. Because see, unless the larger public, the wider public at large is not participating in these projects, is not participating in highlighting contaminated sites in the country, till then the remediation measures won't be successful. So local population especially and community participation is required to solve the problem of this contamination, to solve the problem of pollution, and to ensure better ecosystem, better healthcare for our individuals and for future generations as well. Which is why capacity building at local levels and state levels will be very, very critical to make these rules a success. I hope you gained a new perspective from this session. Do let me know what are your views surrounding these environmental rules. I would love to read your comments. All the very best. Have a beautiful day. Thank you.